Earning pretty good money, and that's only going to increase as you become older and senior and more advanced.
Are you logged in?
You think if you start at 20, by the time you're 38, if you do that 20,000 a year in a Shojin IFI, so 10%. Most of our
Oops. Hi everyone. Sorry, I believe there is a slight issue. Sorry, just 1 second. Hi. Well, I'm not sure what's going on my end, but it sounds like everything is okay. So hi everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Jatin Ondia, CEO of Shojin Property Partners. Now, who doesn't like buy-to-let? Now, for years, it was an excellent sector to invest into, and many people saw it as a good alternative or even an addition to the traditional pension. There was cash flow, there's capital growth, what's not to like? However, things have changed, and buy-to-let is not what it once was. Today, I would not recommend anybody buys into an individual buy-to-let property because there are so much better ways to achieve the same or better results with much lower risk. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, before I launch into it, for all our new viewers, I'd like to just give a quick 1-minute background on Shojin. So, assuming this thing behaves, I shall go into that now. Right, hopefully you can all see that. So Shojin was launched in 2009 to provide fractional investment opportunities in UK real estate. We specialize in funding UK real estate development projects, giving investors the opportunity to share in the lucrative returns through various types of investments. We're based in London and we're UK FCA regulated to operate an online digital investment platform, which then enables investors all over the world to access the platform and invest from as little as £5,000 into each individual project. Investors in the UK and globally actually can also invest through companies and trusts. And within the UK, investors can invest using SIP, SAS and ISAs. A lot of our projects are ISA eligible. So today, Shojin has investors in over 50 countries and is the leading provider of fractional real estate investment in the UK. So that's enough about us. Let's jump into something more interesting. Let's talk about buy-to-let. So a lot of people like buy-to-let because obviously, like I said, you've got income stream, you've got capital growth, and a lot of people saw it as a kind of retirement thing. You know, the house prices were just going up year on year, invest in it, and over time, the value will go up. And of course, you get better returns than you probably would get in mainstream markets. And that kind of aligns with something that we've been saying for a while. You know, everyone has access to mainstream markets, investing in the main funds or trackers or even the active funds. But the fact is that mainstream markets are very, very highly efficient. which means it's very hard to beat the market. And therefore, those people that do occasionally beat the market rarely do so consistently. So it's important, and it's good to have an allocation to mainstream markets. However, smart investors, and certainly wealthy investors, always have an allocation to what we can call alternative investments, real estate being one of the biggest alternative investment sectors. And having a percentage of your portfolio in these type of assets means that you're investing in a part of the market where potentially you can earn a lot more profit. And the reason for that is because it's a relatively inefficient market. It's an illiquid and inefficient market, but that's where you get opportunities. And as long as you can manage the risk within that market, then actually there's a lot of upside. So we're going to talk about that today and talk about how you can manage that risk. But the key thing is that I get why people like buy-to-let. I myself have a good buy-to-let portfolio, but then to be fair, I bought it 20 years ago. So what are the challenges in buy-to-let? Well, there are lots. The first thing is, just sourcing the appropriate assets. The fact is that there's a lot of buyers and not enough sellers in the market. As a result, when a potential landlord is going out to try and identify a property to buy, they're getting squeezed. Sorry, I'm just being given a message. Sorry, yeah, my colleague has just reminded me, we figured out what went wrong last time with the chat function, and I am going to turn it on. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them into the chat. Okay, there we go. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, identifying the right asset. So as a landlord, when you're buying the asset, you're competing against a lot of end users. And from an investment perspective, it's hard to beat an end user. An end user can afford to pay more because they're going to live there. So it's becoming, or it has been for a long time, very difficult to find the right type of properties to buy. Then, of course, you've got all the acquisition costs and, as you can see, always technical issues. Okay. And then there's all the acquisition costs. Now, bearing in mind that you've got, apart from all the usual costs of buying a property, the stamp duty is increased for landlords. So the government was really trying to cool the buy-to-let market, and they've really achieved that result by just slapping on another 3% of stamp duty onto that. Obtaining finance. A lot of our investors, for example, a lot of people on the webinar today are international. Getting a UK mortgage for an international person is obviously got its own complexities and difficulties as well. The management of the property, even if you have an agent looking after the property for you, the reality is it's you who's on the hook, if anything goes wrong. So you almost need to manage the agents to make sure they're doing everything that they need to be doing. And that particularly ties into the item two lines down, which is regulations. Regulations are constantly changing, and they're tightening up left, right, and center. It used to be that you could have 3 or 4 people sharing an apartment or a house, students, young professionals. Nowadays, you've got to get an HMO license, and there are all sorts of other requirements that attach to that, which has really increased a lot of the costs in terms of running a buy-to-let portfolio. You've also got the maintenance issues. There are costs involved. As an individual, you're almost kind of buying or covering those costs on an individual basis, which is very different to when you do it on a portfolio basis. You're not getting the economies of scale. So you're not getting much efficiency within that. Then, of course, we've got tax, our good old friend tax. In the UK, the taxes, or the tax position was changed several years ago. So you can no longer offset your interest against your income fully. You can only offset about at the basic rate of tax, which is 20, well, currently still 20%. But really the biggest thing, and I think the one thing I think a lot of people in buy-to-let don't realize, is the concentration risk. Now, if you have £100,000 to put into a property, and you buy a property, you use £100,000 and you borrow, you get a mortgage and you buy a property. The fact is, you've got a concentrated risk in that one property. And basic portfolio theory tells us that actually what you really want to do, if you can achieve the same kind of returns or better, actually just spread that risk. Because it also ties into the next item, which is liquidity. individual properties are not liquid. You can't, you can sell it. It just takes time. You can refinance. If you need to get some money out, of course you can refinance. That takes time. So putting together concentration, risk, and liquidity are a couple of major items, which I think most people don't really fully factor in. But when you take all of these things together, this is why today I would not buy an individual buy-to-let. Instead, there's a better way. So let's look at the property landscape first of all to understand what's going on. The UK has a huge supply-demand imbalance. I've been saying this every time. This isn't getting any better. We've got a severe shortage of housing. You've got more people looking to buy every year. Every year, 500,000 graduates come out of university. They want to buy, or a lot of people want to buy. So let's look at what's been going on in the sales side of things. Now, the top graph comes from the presentation we did last month, which actually picks up a lot of the earlier data or the data from earlier this year from a Knight Frank report, which showed that prices were actually increasing. Both Halifax and Nationwide were showing that prices were increasing. Although the increases were coming down, they were still increasing quite considerably, between 10 and 11%. We also noticed that the dotted line is showing the ratio of buyers to sellers. Basically, it's telling us that there's 7.5 buyers for every property on the market. So that just goes to show that supply-demand imbalance. Now, we also know that in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of volatility and uncertainty. Initially, obviously, we had the rising in inflation in the first instance. Obviously, that was going to impact interest rates. And then we had the whole issues around Liz Truss coming in and Kwarteng and their mini budget. However, I am pleased to note that with Rishi having come in, a lot of things have stabilized. Gilt yields are down, interest rate expectations or peak rate expectations are down. During just after the mini budget, people were thinking rates were going to peak at around 7%. Now they're talking about 5%. A lot more stability means that, mortgage lenders are coming back into the market. They all froze for a while, but there is clear signs that they are coming back. And we're even starting to see the return of the discount rate mortgage, which nobody here who wasn't buying property in the early noughties would have even heard of. But it's basically where, even though base rates might be higher, they're offering discounts on that rate because they basically want to be lending money. So these things are starting to happen now. But if we look at just the bottom graph, this is also quite interesting. And it's kind of expected when you consider what's been going on. So over the last 3 months, so while prices were increasing at a rate of 10% a few months ago, now those growth rates have dropped down almost to zero. And they're still, I think they're hovering around 3% or something. Again, this was kind of expected because there was a lot of uncertainty in the market. A lot of people pulled back. They weren't sure what they wanted to do. They weren't sure where interest rates were going to go. They couldn't get a mortgage. So all of these things were affecting the market. People are talking about potentially prices softening further. A lot of people ask whether we think there's going to be a crash. And the short answer is no, we don't think it's going to be a crash. We do think that there will be price softening. So not just growth rates coming down, but actually some areas will be going into negative territory. But I think it's very specific on location. And this is the view taken by a lot of the experts in the real estate market. Major cities, commuter zones, coastal areas, these are all still, they've got high demand. They've got a lot of people moving there. Over the last few years, in particular, over the last 10 years, I'd say, a lot of firms have moved, for example, up north and into the Midlands, Birmingham, Manchester, Nottingham, Leicester, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool. And this is driving a lot more demand from people, from young people in particular, to get on the housing ladder and buy apartments. So as long as you're in the right locations, you may not get much growth, but you're not going to get much kind of negative growth either. If you're not in those kind of core regions, then there is a good chance prices will come down, possibly up to about 5%, maybe a bit more. But again, the next few weeks really will be telling. The Sunak's going to be reporting on the budget. It is expected that, he has come in, he's quite conservative. It is expected that will lead to further stabilization of the market and therefore more availability of mortgages and so on. The other thing you'll notice in the graph at the bottom is that the ratio of buyers to sellers has also dropped, which isn't surprising. So from 7 buyers for every seller, it's dropped down to about 5 buyers for every seller. Partly this is because of all the uncertainty in the market. A lot of buyers will have pulled out, will be sitting on the sidelines. We don't expect that to necessarily shoot up over the coming weeks, but we do expect and definitely depending on Rishi's statements in a few weeks' time, we do expect demand to pick up again. A lot of people have just been waiting on the sidelines. So we do expect people to come back into the market. But let's look at the other side. So, before we go into the other side, this is another good graph. It just tells us how many days on average it's taking to secure a new buyer. And it was around 37 in September last year. It gone up towards the end of the year. December is always a slow month anyway, but then it had come down to about 31 days in April this year, which is when we did see a lot of the price rises as well. That has now increased to about 37. So sales are definitely slower, but they're happening, which is good. But let's look at the other side. There's been a lot of shifting trends around the way people want to live. Now, obviously, a lot of people, especially younger people, can't afford to buy. That's a given. But actually, what is, and there is a lot of first-time buyer incentives on the market. The government is still supporting that part of the market. But actually, what we're seeing is a lot of young people don't want to buy. They want to have social mobility. They want to be able to move around the country wherever the most interesting jobs are. It's not so much, it used to be that you'd buy or rent a place in London, you buy a place in London, then you'd be working in London for the next 15 years. That doesn't happen anymore. And there's a lot of opportunities in the regional cities now. So people actually want social mobility. They may not even be in the UK in 2 years' time. They may be working elsewhere. So as a result, we're seeing a huge increase in the rental market. And there's some really good graphs to show this. The top graph shows the tenant demand over the past 3 months. And you can see here that the net balance is still 40% up. Tenant demand has been huge over I'd say probably most of this year, actually. It has come down from its peak, but it's still very, very high. And then if you look at the bottom graph, this shows that the amount of properties coming onto the market has dropped. And that's being driven by things like a lot of landlords pulling out of the market altogether because of all the additional stresses and risks that they face and the funding issues and the regulations and so on. So you've got reducing supply in the rental market, but you've got increasing demand. So naturally, rental rates are going to go up. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Data from the ONS is showing that across the UK, rents were shooting up. But interestingly enough, it wasn't London leading the way. It was the rest of the UK leading the way, which again makes sense. A lot of people are relocating to the regional cities. And this big influx of workers and talent, especially following COVID, has driven up demand for rental property. So it's not surprising that rents have increased much more outside of London. But across the UK, they're going up. In fact, recently, I've been hearing about eye-watering increases in rents in London itself. So this is happening everywhere. So let's look at the buy-to-let headwinds then. So there are a lot of things going on. This increasing regulation is one of the biggest things. A lot of regional cities in particular, especially where there's universities, they are struggling with local housing. Families cannot buy houses to live in. So, people are having, kids in a 2-bed flat. Local councils have recognized that families need space. But what's happened over the last 20, 30 years, a lot of housing stock has been used for students and young professionals. So they've been carved up into what we can call HMOs. So what a lot of councils have actually done is, on the one hand, is to drive up the quality of the housing stock, especially those that are HMOs. But actually, on the other side, it's also to reduce the number of landlords using housing stock as rental property for students and young professionals. So what they're doing is they're increasing regulations, and they're bringing into what's called the HMOs, houses in multiple occupation. It used to be if you had 5 or more people, you'd be classed as an HMO. You'd have to get a license. You'd have to get all sorts of additional safety measures put into the property, fire measures, and so on. The quality side doesn't bother me, but what's happening is that that threshold, that 5, has come down to 4, has come down to 3, and even 2 in some cases. So every city has its own ability to decide at which point they want everything to be licensed. Now, the other side of licensing is it brings in a lot of money for the local council as well. And right now, everyone needs a bit of cash. So when you put all of this together, that's really weighing down on landlords. So you've got rising costs, reducing margins, you've got higher risk with all these regulations. Half the time you don't even know whether you're breaching any regulations. It's very difficult to stay on top of this unless you're doing this as a full-time job, right? Don't get me wrong. I know there are several of our viewers may well be professional HMO landlords. That works. But actually for the majority of people who have a normal day job, it's hard to stay on top of it all. And you can't just rely on the agent. If they get something wrong, it still falls back on you. You are liable for anything that they've missed, in effect. So it's a lot of hassle, and the government hasn't made any secret of this. They want professional landlords. They want higher quality. If you take countries outside the UK, the US, parts of Europe, they have professionally run rental buildings. The UK doesn't really have that yet, but it is going to start to happen, or it has already started happening. So because of all of these reasons, buy-to-let is no longer the right strategy. So instead, build-to-rent is. Build-to-rent, what is it? Let's, first of all, it's quite simple. It's an entire building that's being developed for rental purposes. It could be for rental to private individuals. It could be young professionals. You could have a whole bunch of apartments in a building. You could even have houses. So there are some firms now looking at developing 100 houses, but all for rental. It could be PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation, for the student market. Like I said, councils want students out of the houses and into the purpose-built student accommodation. It could be for senior living, for social housing, anything basically that involves renting as opposed to buying. And I'd say the market is probably where PBSA, or purpose-built student accommodation, was about 20 years ago, i.e. it's in its absolute infancy. So if you look at the aggregate numbers, this shows how many units have been completed, and it's not actually that many. When you consider the aggregate demand, actually the amount of development that's been done in this space is tiny, but it's starting. It is starting to increase. More planning is getting approved for this, and a lot of institutions are also starting to look into this space. The other thing is, with student numbers going up, that's putting an additional strain on a lot of these regional, in London and regional cities. The graph here just shows the UK numbers alone, 18-year-olds applying for university places, which has gone from 34% in 2013 up to about 44% today. Now, that doesn't even include all the international students that come into the UK. And those numbers are growing as well. And especially post-COVID, a lot of people missed out on coming to the UK during COVID. So that's adding further pressure to the overall system. So the institutions have definitely started looking at this, people like Blackstone, but they're looking at the mega schemes. They've got to deploy billions. However, we see an opportunity, and that is in the middle market. Because what we've seen over the last few years is developments that are done. Let's say they're building 100 apartments. Those 100 apartments can be put for sale onto the main market, end buyers, that's fine. But actually, that entire development can also be used as private rental schemes. And because of the aggregate value of those, some of these blocks might only be worth 30 or 40 million pounds. And I say only because they're too small for the mega institutions. They need to deploy hundreds of millions at a time. They don't want to buy a block with 100 apartments worth only about 30, 35 million. However, the opportunity this presents is we're funding these developments. We're providing the equity for these developments. Well, I say we, you are, our investors are. So we already have the inside track on a lot of these developments. We are therefore in a unique position to negotiate a purchase of the development at the end of the project. Now, some investors like to invest in the development period because obviously the returns are higher, but the risks are obviously slightly higher as well. But other investors like to invest in finished assets like buy-to-let property. So instead of investing in an individual buy-to-let property, you can actually now invest into one of these blocks, one of these buildings. And we'll go through it in a moment as to some of the benefits. But the key thing is, individually, it's still a cash flow play and it's still a capital growth play. But there's a third element. And the third element is once you've got enough of these buildings together, you can package them into something called a REIT, a real estate investment trust, which is a special type of vehicle or fund, if you like, for investing into real estate. And this is a very tax efficient vehicle. All the profits get paid out without any tax held back. But to qualify for that, you've got to have asset values of 300-400 million minimum just to make it viable. So that's part of the strategy that we're putting into place now. Initially, you can go into individual buildings, spread your investment across individual buildings. But there's an underlying strategy which looks to pool these buildings together and sell them into the institutional market. By doing that, simple restructuring, you end up getting a yield compression of at least about 1%, which absolutely boosts your returns. So let me explain. I'm going to take an example of buying an individual property. So as an investor, let's say I've got a 100, 200,000 pounds to invest, whatever it is. I could buy an individual flat and I could pay for it with cash. I could buy an individual flat with a mortgage, or I can go via one of these platforms and do it on a fractional basis with the same level of investment. But now the platform's buying 100 apartments. So let's look at what the numbers say. Now, I've simplified this down. There's a lot more that obviously goes into this, but I think you'll get the gist of where I'm going with this. So let's take a property. Let's say you're buying it at £500,000. You've got your stamp duty. Remember, you've got your extra stamp duty on that as well, because it's a buy to let. You've got your legal fees, your furniture. So you've got a total cost of £540,000. Now, this is a cash purchase. This is the singular reason why I tell everybody never just to use all cash to buy property. Borrow, leverage, because you know what? It's still relatively cheap. So that's the amount of money you need to put in, 540K. Your income is £25,000. So we've done this based on a 5% yield, fairly respectable. Obviously not in central London. So, you'd be looking at commuter zones for that. We've allowed for a 3% void period. We've allowed for 10% agency fees, service charges and ground rent and maintenance. That gives you net annual income of £18,750. Now, we've made an assumption here of 3% inflation. I know inflation is not 3%, but we could use 10%, but I think that would just be overselling what we're saying. So let's just use 3%, but obviously all the comparisons use the same rate of growth. So the same applies, it just multiplies. So let's assume a 3% rate of inflation. The value after 5 years is just under £580,000. So that means a capital profit of just under 80,000 and rental income over 5 years of about 100K, which comes to about £180,000. Your return on cash is therefore 33% or 6.6% on a simple annualized basis. I'm not doing IRRs. This is a very, very simple example. So I'm just doing a simple annualized return. Now let's look at the same thing, but with a mortgage. Now this time you're only putting in £240,000 instead of £540,000. And you're borrowing £300,000, which is a 60% loan to value. And you're borrowing that at 5% on a fixed 5-year term. Appreciate rent mortgage levels are moving around, but let's just go with it for the moment. So that's your 5% interest. So you can see your pre-tax income has dropped from 18,000 down to just under 4,000. Apply the same inflation and capital growth levels and so on, but you'll see that your total return is now 8.6%. Because remember, you put in a lot less cash. And that immediately gives you a 30% increase in terms of return on capital compared to the cash purchase. Now, if you've got £540,000 to deploy, buy 2 flats, right? So you can do that, but the idea is you're generating a much higher return. Now, let's go on to the one where we look at the platform. Now, in this case, the idea is very simply, we're not buying 1 unit, we're not buying 5, we're not buying 10. In fact, we're buying the whole building. So let's say it's 100 units. So really, if we're going to buy that, we'd be looking at least a 6% yield, because you'd be taking a discount on the base of purchasing the entire block. So a 16% overall discount. You'd have stamp duty, you'd be doing a company transfer on that. You'll notice your legal fees. You're paying £2,000 for 1 flat. So in theory, it should be £200,000, but it's not, because you're buying 1 block. Your furniture costs are lower because you're getting economies of scale on that. Your bank arrangement fee, 1%. So you're borrowing 25%, same loan to value, and you're putting in 17.7 million cash. Now, In reality, I would probably carve this up with mezzanine and then equity, which would then boost the equity returns. But for the moment, let's assume that whole £17.7 million is equity. So you have the same rent, just multiplied by 100, same voids. But now, instead of having an agency fee, you're basically getting an operator in. So you're paying an operator fee, but you're also then paying a building maintenance fee, because you've got to keep the communal areas and the apartments all updated and so on. So between those two things, you're looking at about 17%, and obviously you've got the plus VAT there as well. Your bank interest, assuming the same rate, 5%, because it's 60% loan to value, that's doable. You're paying that much interest, which gives you pre-tax income of £715,000. Now, the platform, in this case, like if it was Shojin, we'd be taking 20%. That's how we would monetize our position. And the rest of it would go to investors. Now, if you assume that you're selling after 5 years, but you're selling it as a block again, you're not selling it as individual units, which obviously would give you a much higher price. So you're keeping it as it is. And you're generating some capital uplift, therefore, and your income over that time. We take 20% of all of that. It leaves you with about £9.4 million over the 5-year period. And you see the overall return on cash is 53%, which is a 10.7% simple annualized return. And that is a 24% increase on what you had in terms of doing it individually. So over here, you're buying it yourself with a mortgage. Here, you're doing it through a platform, but you're getting a higher return and a hell of a lot less hassle. But if you were going to buy something for cash, this gives you a 62% increase. But it doesn't stop there, because we've already said, yes, you're getting a higher return by doing it this way, because you're getting the economies of scale, right? It's like almost like having a buying club, if you like. But as I mentioned earlier, that annualized return could be as high as 20% per annum if the whole portfolio is packaged up into a REIT and therefore sold into the institutional market, which is just a 1% yield compression. Your annualized return jumps up to 20%. Similarly, if you decide, okay, we don't want to package it into a REIT, we want to sell them as individual units, you'd be getting a similar kind of uplift. So there are all these other avenues you can go down. And part of it is because you're buying at a decent price on day one. You're getting all the economies of scale. So all of this boosts your individual profits. And then you have the opportunity to participate in something like a REIT. So if you look at that, I mean, that's over 200% increase on the leverage position. So if you're going to buy one flat, get a mortgage and rent it out, potentially using this model, you'd be getting an extra over 200% increase on that. But there are other benefits. You know, I mentioned earlier how liquidity is a huge one. If you own an individual buy-to-let and you need to withdraw £10,000, £20,000, the best you can normally do is go and get another loan or refinance it. You might have to pay breakage costs on the old one. You'd have to get a new valuation done. You know, there are all sorts of things that go on. But when you're doing it through a platform, on a fractional platform, you can sell your position on the secondary market. So let's say that you invested, for argument's sake, £100,000. And in a year's time, your daughter, I don't know, needs a new car and you need to take £20,000 out. Well, you can sell £20,000 worth of your position in there. So you have that liquidity and you can leave the other 80,000 in there. So that is one extremely big advantage. But the other big one is it's totally 100% passive. The whole management side, the maintenance, the finance, getting the mortgage, all that stuff. But most importantly, the regulatory side, you're not actually on the hook for anything because we would have professional management in there. And so all the regulations would be met through that process. So all in all, it's a much, much better way to invest in buy-to-let. It's a better alternative to buy-to-let, but giving you, more upsides, the same benefits, but more upsides, and certainly a lot less hassle. So I'm going to move on to questions in 2 seconds, but just before I do, have a look on our website for a lot of the current open opportunities. And we often get calls from people or people asking if they can just have a quick chat about one of the investments. We're very happy to do that. So in fact, what we are going to do today is we are going to circulate an email after this webinar to everyone, and just fill in your details, and in there you can actually book a call with one of our investment team if you want to talk through any of the projects. A lot of these projects are ISA eligible, as you can see here. Some of them are quite short term. So Leicester Block 8 is short term. There's about 11 months left to run on that. The other ones are about 18 months. Some are a little bit longer. So have a look at all the details are on the website. So you'll have to register if you haven't already done so and go through the appropriateness test. But let us know if you want to talk through it, or if you have any questions whatsoever. Now, before I go on to questions, just want to let you know that our last webinar of the year will be next month on the 24th, where we'll be talking about what we are seeing as the outlook for 2023 and where some of the opportunities are potentially likely to be. And by then, we'll have a little bit more clarity following the Rishi Sunak's and the Chancellor's report on the budget as well. So, hopefully we'll get a lot more clarity about where things are going. So do register for that. And finally, if you have any questions, of course, you can always contact us here in the UK. And we also have representation in East Africa and in Asia. So feel free to get in touch with any of our officers. Okay, I am going to move to questions. So if you have questions, do stick it on the chat. And I know we are live as well on a live stream. So I will check that one as well. Okay, so let's get the first question. Alan, great question, great question. I'm going to read it out because I think it's kind of a good one. Right, so fractional has a bit of a bad name, doesn't it? From dodgy deals in Liverpool. Yes, we've all seen those. Not sure if you're seeing my, fractional sales has had a bad rep, previously popular in Liverpool and Manchester, where developers paid investor money out to consultants within the group structures, high fees, so companies went bust before anything was built. How can investors be sure that this is any different? Okay, first thing, and this is probably the single most important thing, is to whenever you're making an investment, understand everything possible about the company that's actually structuring it and managing it for you. Now, one of the first things is, for example, Shojin is fully FCA regulated. Now, that doesn't mean that your money's guaranteed in any way, but it just means that we have to go through a lot of rigorous checks, and we have to abide by the FCA's rules in terms of the way we promote investment and the way that we manage the investments over here. So a lot of that is quite regulated, and therefore that should give you some level of confidence, but that's just the first step. The second step is fractional. A lot of people that did these fractional deals in the past were the developers themselves. And this, in my view, is one of the single biggest risks, because when you give your money direct, developers are lovely people. I love them. But as an investor, if you're not an expert on that project, how are you going to assess what the developer is telling you in terms of the updates and about what's going on? So at Shojin, we're like that person in between. We have our own money in the project, and we only make money at the end. That's when we make our real profit as part of the spread. So what we do is we vet every single project that comes in. We do full due diligence in-house. We have a multi-stage due diligence process going through almost 200 items. It's intense. We reject the majority of projects. We cherry pick the ones where we are, pretty confident, or I'd say as bang on 100% as possible, confident that nothing's going to go wrong with the project. And then we look at, where are the risks in the project? Can they be mitigated? Can we remove them to reduce our risk? And ultimately, by the time we list a project, you're looking at a project which should have compared to the level of return you're achieving, a very low level of risk. But it doesn't stop there, because that's just the day one. That's just going into the project. We then monitor every project to the nth degree. So we go to site on a regular basis. We go to every design team meeting. That's the meeting with the entire professional party. Because quite often you'll hear from those professional team meetings, you might hear something the developer may not want to tell you directly. So we want to make sure we know as much as possible about what's going on that project. We have an external monitoring surveyor that also monitors the project and reports into us, but we also like to do it ourselves, just to make sure that if the monitoring surveyor is missing something, we might catch it, and vice versa. But it also doesn't stop there, because we go through every project twice a week to really look at, is everything still on track? Every month, we look at the expected versus actuals on the cash flows. We look at where every bit of money is going. Remember, the money is drawn in arrears from a senior loan. So our money often goes in first because we're in junior funding, and then you get the senior loan coming in. So we check that the drawdown notice issued by the developer, the monitoring surveyor's job is to make sure that the drawdown notice issued by the surveyor matches the work done on site. We also go on site and do the same thing, but we also then check what happens afterwards to make sure that money is going where it's supposed to go. Developers, lovely people, but are notorious for moving money around from one place to another, depending on who's shouting loudest. We don't like that. For example, if an electrician has done £50,000 worth of work and they've issued their invoice, and that's what the bank has given them the £50,000 for, we want to make sure it goes to that person. So we will constantly review that on a monthly basis, expected versus actuals on the cash flows, and cross-check all of that with where the money is actually going. So I think ultimately, Alan, and I hope this is, it's a bit of a long-winded response to your question, but ultimately the point is we are representing the investors. We are the investors' eyes and ears. And we are incentivized. We're rewarded very, very well, but at the end, only when the investor gets paid. So that's why we want to make sure that everything is going according to plan. The schemes that you're talking about were operated in a very, very different way, certainly not from regulated platforms, usually from the developer themselves. And therefore, they had a lot of different risks in them. I think that should have answered your question, Alan, but if there is any follow-up question, stick it on the chat and I'll be happy to answer that. I'll have a look on this one as well. A good question. Well, that's a good question. Question from Ralph. As this is my first knowledge of Shojin and yourself, if there is time, would you tell us about you, Jatin, or a little bit of your history? So I'll say it's a good question because I love to talk about myself, but I won't take up too much time. But in short, my background is investment banking. I spent about 12 years with UBS Investment Bank. I was on the kind of structured solutions risk side, working with institutional clients to optimize investment portfolios. So really minimizing risk, maximizing returns. I'd always invested in real estate since '98. And therefore, having invested in real estate over the years, that's really what got us to launching Shojin, because over the years, both myself and my business partner had invested in real estate, and we were generating almost like a full income stream from real estate while working full-time jobs. And a lot of people were asking whether they could invest with us, because most people don't have the time to do it themselves. And that's really how we started Shojin, because a lot of people said, if you're doing something, can we just put some money in with you? And that's how we started this business. And we started in buying high yielding properties and moved into renovation projects, which then evolved into construction projects. So we did our own construction projects. My partner's background was construction, he's a quantity surveyor. But then we realized that there was a big funding gap in the market for mid-market developers. So developers doing projects of say between 10 and 65 million pounds, they couldn't get the funding they needed to do their projects. And as a result, the margins in that middle market were much, much higher than at the lower end of the market or the upper end of the market. At the lower end of the market, you've got all the amateur developers and they overpay for site. With the larger developments, you've got all the institutions fighting over those. But in the middle, there's very few people fighting over them. The reason is because they can't get the funding. They can get the senior funding, but they often can't get the junior funding. So that's what we started doing. We started saying to these developers, bring us your projects. We'll look at it. We'll go through our own due diligence process. If it's the kind of project we would have done ourselves, we'll back you. We'll provide the cash that you need, and then we'll share the profits. So that's really how we got to where we are. And then around 2015, 2016, we applied for an FCA license because we realized that what we were doing while we were tapping into our own high net worth investor groups, we realized that there was an opportunity for investors worldwide to invest into these products. And that's why we became regulated to launch this as an online investment platform. So that's, hopefully that gives you a little bit of background, but, I'm always happy to have a chat if you want to follow up. Alan, I'm so sorry. I think you've said I need to put the left-hand screen on display to expand it to make the figures readable. So I do apologize if the figures were not readable. I'll check that because it was full screen on my side. Yeah, okay, great question, or a great comment, actually, I should say, from Matthias. So, oops, where's it gone? All very interesting, but none of the rental focused REITs in the UK market, are there just a handful come anywhere near this return? How is what you've got different? First of all, let me explain. Residential REITs were not even allowed more than a few years ago. And once, you know, it used to only be commercial REITs, and commercial REITs have much lower returns, exactly as you said. But then once they allowed residential property to go into REITs, a few people dabbled and they did try launching 50, 100 million pound REITs, but it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is what they were doing was they were buying regular property dotted all around the country and then trying to package that up into this REIT. And they found that when you combine the management costs of that together with the actual costs of being listed, remember REITs are listed on the stock exchange, the whole thing just wasn't viable. What's different with what I'm suggesting today is, first of all, forget the REIT. First of all, we're buying a building, right? We've got the buildings. We've already funded several developments and we're negotiating to buy them. For anyone who's in our Nottingham investment, it's very similar, right? It's buying an entire building. We get leverage on it. You know, we then have an operator in there who operates it. We manage the operator, and it provides cash flow. You also get capital growth to that through that. Usually, once it's stabilized after a couple of years, you get a big uptick in the value. At which point you can usually actually remove some of the capital because you can get higher leverage at that point, and then it's just a cash cow. The REIT is where things get interesting. But the whole point is that, remember, at this stage, we still bought at a 6% yield. And even if you forget the capital growth that's already happened, we've got a product with a 6% yield. It can't go into a REIT, or it can't be a REIT at that stage. It's too small. But once we put it together with 5 or 6 other blocks, now we can package it into a REIT where the economics make sense. And the yield, just through the restructuring, the yield goes from 6 to 5%, because now you're listing it and you're selling it into an institutional market. So what we're doing, which is different, is we're not beginning in a REIT. The REIT comes later. What we're doing for now is acquiring the asset, because no one really has a big enough portfolio to create a residential REIT as things stand today. So you've got the benefit of, it's better than buy to let because you're still getting your cash flow, you're still getting your capital growth, and you're getting it completely passive, don't have to do anything, which will give you a better return than buy to let. But then as your bonus, the exit is either selling the units individually, where you get an uplift in the value, or you package it into this REIT where you get the price uplift by taking it from a yield of 6% to 5%. So I hope that makes sense, but we will explain all this a lot more when we launch our first project in that space. I mean, we've already done Nottingham, so anyone who's in Nottingham already knows that, but we're about to do, well, hopefully soon do another one on the pure residential side, which might be linked to Slough or Reading, because we like both of those sites and we are negotiating to buy them from the developer, or in partnership buy them with the developer once he's finished developing them. Right, question from Lasios. Do you currently have any build to rent projects on your platform? No, unfortunately, there are no projects on there right now. What we have asked is the Nottingham is a purpose-built student accommodation building, which is 124 studio apartments. That's actually done really, really well. We managed to actually return about 30% of investors' cash last year. And the running income on that is very strong. I think we were getting something like 8.5% initially. That's gone up now because a lot of money's been returned. We only own 40% of that building. The developer owns the other 60%. We are negotiating with the developer to take another 30% from him and provide that on our platform. So that will probably be launching soon. But the other ones that will hopefully launch soon is if we negotiate the price with the developers who are currently developing Slough and Reading, we want those. They're both London commuter zones. They've got a lot of upside. So so really watch this space. Keep checking back in on our platform, and do take a look, because we do have a lot of new projects in the pipeline. So good. It's a great thing. Give me your view on what is your view about high inflation in the UK? Yeah. How does it impact on the construction costs and the profit margin of the projects for the coming 2 to 3 years? As a development may last 2 to 3 years, will the developer provide valuation annually? What if the valuation of development property drops substantially due to the economic recession? Will more security be provided? Okay, so first of all, for the last kind of, I'd say, what, 8, 9, 10 months, a lot of this inflationary pressure has come into the press, but actually it was there from last year. We saw it in the construction industry. Supply lines were hit badly during COVID. So prices were already shooting up. And then obviously this year with everything in Ukraine and the energy prices, obviously things have carried on going up. When we do our due diligence on a project, we stress test them extensively to see what can the project withstand. Now, when we're looking at things like construction costs, we already factor in a certain amount of inflation going forward. Remember, a lot of the contracts tend to be fixed price contracts, but those subcontractors also need to pre-purchase a lot of their materials and things like that. So we make sure that all the way down the chain, everyone is strong, financially strong. One of the biggest issues in construction development is construction companies can go out of business quite easily if they don't manage their cash flow properly. So for us, because of the size of projects we look at, in pretty much all cases, we have something called a construction bond, which actually protects against the contractor going bust. So if they haven't actually hedged their own costs, or if they haven't pre-purchased things, and then they find prices have gone up more than they expected and they go out of business, we're insured for any additional costs incurred as a result of that when we move to another contractor. But in reality, what we do is we assess it all up front. We look at where prices are today, where we think the biggest stresses are, and we kind of fatten up the construction cost to allow for that. And then anything that we're still uncertain about, we will add into the contingency as well. Because what we want to make sure is that on day one, we're going in with a very, very conservative number. Now, a couple of good examples are our friends in the developer on Slough. Last year, he was doing an office to residential conversion, and he was insistent that he was going to get his build costs at under 100 a square foot. We weren't having it. We were insisting, no, we're not happy with that. And in the end, we funded it, but based on 110 a square foot. Remember, it's conversion, not construction. But anyway, as it turned out, he did manage to get the construction cost in under £100 a square foot. And that's fine. I'd rather it go that way than the other way. So we are going in ultra conservative from the outset, which should give us enough margin of safety against any movements in the market. On a good note, though, actually, construction costs are stabilizing. So compared to, I think, what we saw maybe 6 months ago, actually things are stabilizing a bit more now. So you're having a bit more certainty. I think that's more because the supply lines are opened up. So they're still expensive because of the energy supplies and all of those things, but because the actual factories are open and the ships are all in the right places now, the products are flowing better. Right, what is our view about inflation? Yeah, look, inflation is going to carry on for a while. I mean, I think they're talking about, even though gas prices, I think wholesale gas prices have come down by 50%, but that's not going to trickle through to the end users for quite a while because of the way that the whole hedging strategy works with energy supplies. So look, I think the way we're looking at it is inflation will still be up there for the next maybe 6 months, but we do see things starting to stabilize kind of slowly as that 6 months goes on. Maybe 6, maybe 9 months, inflation will be high. I don't think they'll be back down to their 3% target or 2.5% target for at least 12 months, if not a bit more. But I do see it coming down in due course. For now, I think we've just got to factor in the higher inflation. The higher inflation, by the way, also has an impact on funding costs. So I mentioned earlier how actually the mortgage market is calming down. Anyone who tried to get a mortgage in September knows what a mess the market was. Actually, everyone's view is just sit tight, give it a few weeks, let the Rishi effect settle in, let him do his next little mini budget, and by then you should see some stability in mortgage rates. They're not going to be 3%. Those days are gone, right? Or 2% or 1%. Base rates had to go up. Everyone expected them to go up. So that part wasn't really much of a surprise. I think the surprise factor was when Kwarteng made his announcement, and then people were talking about 7% peak rates coming very soon. That shocked everyone. Now they're talking about 5% peak rates. That's pretty normal. That's actually, interest rates shouldn't be at 0 or 1%. So I think there's almost like a normalization of the market starting to happen. As the development may last for 2 to 3 years, will the developer provide valuations annually? Not really. I mean, what happens is most of our projects tend to be 2 years max, but the construction time tends to be about 18 months. So we have the valuation done at the start. And then during the project, obviously, when they're starting the sales process, you actually see what the real market value is, whether it's higher or lower than expected. And on that basis, we would adjust our figures and expectations. It wouldn't be formally valued because there'd be no, if you're getting real market values, if you're seeing real buyers coming in and saying, well, yeah, we'll buy this at this price, then well, that's the market price. Any valuer can't beat that. So we do incorporate that into our update, and we provide that to investors. And then based on that, if it's a profit share, then we'll give you the adjustment, what it means for your overall profit. But a lot of the projects we're funding today or nowadays is actually fixed return. So it's either mezzanine, or if it's equity, it's preferred equity, purely fixed return. So the slight variations don't really affect us that much. And what happens if the valuation drops substantially? So most of our projects are stress tested and can normally withstand at least 20% reduction in value. If it's going to be much more than that, obviously problems do start to emerge. Which is why we have mezzanine and equity in most cases. Equity is the first in line to get affected if something does go wrong. If the market did crash tomorrow, it will be the equity that will get affected. The mezzanine will probably still be further cushioned by another 5 or 6%. However, the equity is only hit if there's nothing you can do to extend the timeline on the overall facility, if you like, if there's a senior loan in there. Sometimes, well, because of the locations that we're picking, and we saw this after the 2008 crash, actually, if you're in the right locations, you'll bounce back fairly quickly. Now, back then, a lot of the northern regions didn't bounce back that quickly, but they weren't as well established as they are today. So actually, we would expect that to recover fairly swiftly, but equity is always first at risk. So it's important to bear that in mind. If you're more risk averse, then it's better to go for mezzanine or something with a first charge. So like there's a project up there I mentioned earlier, the Leicester one, which is a first charge bridge loan, and it's got 11 months to run. So if you're really risk averse, that's the kind of thing you'd go for. Right, question from Lung. Are any new projects in the pipeline? Yes, there are. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say where they are. All of them are in the Greater London area, though, if that helps. And they will be, what we're doing, I think I mentioned this before, is we're trying to get the projects finished, funded first, so that investors' money isn't sitting there waiting for the legal work to complete. So what we'll do is we'll pre-fund it and then we'll launch it. So we will have 3 exciting kind of Greater London projects coming on soon. Let me come to this side, onto the live stream. Oluwasun, I hope I've pronounced that right. Can we get a recording of this? Yes, you absolutely can. In fact, it will be circulated automatically after the webinar or within a few hours. And Alan mentioned the same thing, that the detail in the slides was not too clear. So I'll share that. That's fine. So Alex is asking, so Shojin is effectively a forward funding partner for apartments and housing schemes. Technically, we're not. Right now, we're not. Right now, our core business is providing junior funding for real estate development. So we provide mezzanine and we provide equity. But we have from time to time purchased assets that we think actually we're buying at the right price. The Nottingham student accommodation scheme was one good example, but we did that after the project finished. What we're starting to do is actually start having that conversation earlier with developers, because if we can strike the right price with the developer, it gives them certainty of exit, but it gives us certainty of actually getting that asset, and then we'll start the fundraise for it and offer it out to our investor base. So at the moment, we're not technically forward funding, and even then we won't forward fund because we don't do senior funding yet, but actually we are due to get a senior funding line. And if we do, and we are buying the asset, then we could actually end up in a whole forward funding scenario. Hope that makes sense. Give me a shout if you want to talk about it. Deepak, please elaborate on SIP and SAS will apply to these projects. Pension pot can also be used. Yeah, so SIP and SAS are like privately managed pensions, really, and SIP, self-invested pension plan, and SAS, I've forgotten what it stands for. But ultimately, if you're a company owner, I think you can have a SAS, which means basically you can put money, instead of paying yourself salary, you can put it into your pension. Basically, because your investment into any of these projects, so now I'm going back to the development project, tends to be through the issuance of a bond certificate, so or a bond issuance. You're buying a corporate bond, so it's eligible for SIP and SAS. Now, when it comes to the investment into the finished development, that's where you might actually have a slight issue, because it is residential and technically you're not allowed to invest in residential. But we are actually in the process of getting formal advice on that to see if it can be structured in a way that is pension friendly, because you're not technically buying an individual apartment, you're actually buying into the company that owns the block. There might be a way that it can be done, but we'll provide further information on that. But all the other projects you can do through SIP and SAS. And to set up a SIP and SAS, just get in touch with the team here. They'll help you set it up. Right. Let's see. What else do we have? Yeah, somebody else asking for the presentation slides. That's fine. Yeah, we'll circulate that. Right. I think I've answered every single question. Are there any final questions? Okie dokie. All right. Well, you'll get an email anyway, where you will have an opportunity to book a call with one of our team if you have any questions or you just want to talk through any of the projects. So feel free to fill out that form and send it across. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all next month. Bye-bye.